unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grant Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan. The Rohingya people have suffered decades of persecution in Myanmar, most recently in 2017, when the country's security forces launched a major crackdown on the minority group, causing more than 1 million Rohingya to flee that country. While the vast majority of Rohingya sought refuge in neighboring Bangladesh, India has been home to tens of thousands of Rohingya refugees. A new report by the Azadi Project and Refugees International, A Shadow of Refuge, Rohingya Refugees in India, sheds light on the plight of the Rohingya in India, drawing from field visits in both Delhi and Hyderabad. The authors of this new report are Daniel Sullivan and Priyali, and they join me today from Washington and New Delhi, respectively. Dan and Priyali, congrats on the report, and thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks. Pleasure to be here.
So, Dan, let me start with you and just ask you a very big picture question. Your report, of course, is on Rohingya refugees residing in India. But before we get into the nuts and bolts of their situation, I'm wondering if you could just kind of refresh our collective memories a bit. Who are the Rohingya? Why is it that more than 1 million of them have had to flee their homes in Myanmar?
Sure. Most people will probably be familiar with the Rohingya as the victims of genocide in August 2017 at the hands of the Myanmar military authorities. But this goes back decades of the Rohingya being one of the most persecuted people in the world. They're a small Muslim minority in a mostly Buddhist country in Myanmar, and over decades of military rule have been, have been abused and at different times attacked and had to flee. Hundreds of thousands flee the country. But the biggest exodus came in August 2017 and the months that followed, where we saw more than 700,000 that fled into Bangladesh for refuge. And they remain in what is today the largest refugee settlement in the world. But what's lesser known is that there are other Rohingya refugees that have fled to other countries, and that includes India, where there are at least 20,000. And so we wanted to just try to shine a light on this particular population, and as a microcosm of the broader failure, not only to address the basic problems in Myanmar, where they're now a military coup since took place in February 2021, the failure to address that and create the conditions safe for Rohingya to go home, but also in the meantime, the failure of countries in the region, countries of refuge, to provide the most basic levels of protection.
So Priyali, let me just kind of ask you to help us understand a bit, kind of contextualize for us what is going on with Rohingya refugees in India. It's noteworthy that we don't really even have a precise number of how many they are. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees, you mentioned the report, registered about 20,000 refugees. I think in 2017, the Indian government reported there were as many as 40,000 back then. But given that India houses relatively few compared to its neighbor Bangladesh, why do this report and why do this now?
So it's a good question, Milan. And my response to that would be, why not India and why not now? Yes, it is not the 800,000 refugees which are in Bangladesh, but 20,000 in India is actually a significant number. It forms the bulk of the refugee population, mostly in India. And the issues that the report raises, be it the issue of arbitrary and indefinite detention of Rohingya refugees in India, or the fact that they are curtailed from the right to education. These are serious issues. And I would say that if we are talking about people who've been persecuted, who fled violence, and are now being indefinitely detained and languishing in jails, if that's even one person, then it's worth raising in a report. And here we are talking about 20,000. And of course, there are lesser number detained, but we can talk about that more later.
It's very important to be covering where the bulk of the population is, both in Bangladesh and in Myanmar. And we with Refugees International and others have covered that, and it's been well known across the world. The population in India is very much not so well known, and so I think it was really important to add to not focus on the population in India versus other places, but to make sure that they were added to that coverage that already has been going on.
So let me just ask you a quick follow-up on this. I mean, what do we know about when the majority of Rohingya sought refuge in India, and where exactly within India are they living today?
The Rohingya in India have been coming over a number of years, and probably the majority somewhere, following initial crackdowns and violence in 2012, but especially after 2017. And where they're going is mostly to larger cities, settlements, particularly where there is some affinity in terms of religion, Muslim populations. So we see a large population in Hyderabad and in Jammu, and then there's a smaller population in Delhi. And again, it's kind of driven by where they feel like they might face the least kind of backlash, and also where there might be some informal work opportunities.
And I just add to it, you see, because India is not a signatory of the Refugee Convention, there are no refugee camps per se in India. These are all settlements, small settlements or big settlements that come up because some foundation or some individual has felt that they would want to give the land to these people, and sometimes they're also charged rent. So you will see these settlements in really small, dingy, crowded places with really terrible living conditions.
So Priyali, let me just kind of ask you about this, right? Because I think this is something that's going to surprise a lot of people. India doesn't have a domestic law or even a consistent policy on refugees and asylum seekers, right? And why this is surprising is because the country has famously been home to a number of refugees from virtually all of its neighbors, right? Afghanistan, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, even Tibet. Do we know why India has historically resisted codifying its policy into some kind of very clear law or regulatory note?
So, Milan, this would be an assumption, but from what we have kind of gathered based on our research and our interviews, we have found out that different refugee groups in India are given different treatment. Some have more access to different kinds of educational facilities or employment opportunities, or even are given government identity cards, and other refugee populations like the Rohingya are denied from these rights or basic human dignity rights. So I think, and our assumption would be that India does not want to have a standard policy which is applicable to all refugee populations, irrespective of their religion or irrespective of their ethnicity. They want to make sure that they can change it, or they can give out different kind of treatment to different populations. And I think that's been the resistance, perhaps, on something like this. And we all know about the Citizenship Amendment Act, which kind of came in 2019. And the Citizenship Amendment Act kind of just solidifies this assumption, the fact that only certain refugees who are either Hindus or Sikhs or Buddhists or Jains, who are essentially not Muslims, who are coming in India, would be given refuge, and their citizenship would be fast-tracked, whereas other refugee populations who are minority Muslims or even majority Muslims in other countries will not be given any kind of special assistance for asylum seeking or even fast-tracking of citizenship.
One of the things that you write in your report when it comes to the situation of the Rohingya in India is that things have gotten worse in recent years, right? And you don't date this to a political change, the 2014 election when the BJP comes to power, but rather to a series of events that started in February of 2017. Priyali, let me just start with you. Why was this period in particular such an inflection point?
So in 2017, yes, it was not because of a change of a government. You rightly said, right? It was the second term. The BJP government was continuing its tenure in the country. But in 2017, it was a BJP leader in Jammu and Kashmir who actually filed a petition and said that he wanted all the Rohingya refugees in the region of Jammu to be deported. And so that's where it all started. And that kind of led to more rhetoric around it. We did see a lot of hate, a lot of negative statements about Rohingya refugees on social media. Generally, in the parliament, we had cabinet ministers saying things like Rohingya refugees will not be accepted, will not be allowed in the country. That's when even the Supreme Court order Supreme Court was petitioned against the deportation, and then it kind of moved on to saying that it would uphold the deportation of Rohingya refugees. So I think 2017 became an inflection point because this BJP leader had come in and petitioned that Rohingya refugees should be deported.
Yeah, I would just add that that certainly was a turning point, but I think it does go back further, right? Where there has been this narrative by the BJP on this nationalist and anti-Muslim narrative that, unfortunately, for the Rohingya, being Muslim and being refugees just made them kind of an obvious target for that, and so I think that just set the ground for what we've seen in recent years, getting worse and worse.
Now, what's very interesting is Priyali, just to add to what you said, there was this sign of maybe some intergovernmental squabbles in 2022. We had the Minister for Housing and Urban Development tweet that the refugees residing in Delhi would be given basic amenities, access to services, only to have walked that back very quickly. Do you suspect that this was essentially, something he said which was kind of unauthorized or not meant for public consumption?
So I think, Milan, you raise a very interesting point, and I've humored about it. It's like black comedy, right? Because usually you would have the government fight over each other, trying to say, we gave the services to a certain persecuted population or to a vulnerable population. But here you have the central government and you have the Delhi government kind of fighting to say, dude, we didn't give the services. It is you who said that you are giving the services and we didn't. So this is comic, but it's also tragic. We should be giving out housing. We should be giving out basic dignity and human rights and everything that refugee populations who've been persecuted deserve. And over here, we have governments fighting over not giving it to them.
So I want to talk a little bit about the nature of the challenges facing the Rohingya in India, right? Which is really what the bulk of your report is about. And let me start with the issue of detention. One of the most frequently cited fears raised by Rohingya refugees themselves is this prospect of detention. And Dan, maybe I'll turn to you first. To the best of your knowledge, how many Rohingya are actually detained? And tell us a little bit about what their conditions are like as they are under detention.
Sure. I mean, there are varying estimates, but it's easily in the hundreds of Rohingya that are in detention. It's a little bit muddied because of the definition of what is a detention center versus what Indian authorities call a holding center. But in effect, they're all facing these rough conditions in detention. And behind this is also the real risk of deportation or refoulement, which is a violation of international common law, where people who are fleeing persecution should not be forcibly returned. So anybody who is walking along the street as a Rohingya, effectively considered an illegal immigrant despite fleeing genocide, they can be detained at any time. And then with that detention comes the fear of being deported back to the very military regime that has committed genocide. So that's the real fear that Rohingya face day to day. And maybe I'll turn it over to Priyali to talk a little bit about the conditions in detention that we heard from the Rohingya refugees, some of them former detainees themselves.
Thanks, Dan. So to add to that, we're actually following a recent Delhi High Court case, which is petitioning the Delhi High Court to release a 22-year-old mother who was detained indefinitely in April 2020. In fact, the report has interviewed the sister who has petitioned the Delhi High Court. And in that, they clearly talk about, the court case clearly talks about the living conditions in the detention center. They're not allowed any kind of sunlight. They're not allowed to go outside. The lack of sunlight leads to extreme mobility issues because of lack of the deficiency of vitamin D. The food conditions are really bad. But again, to highlight here, the human rights lawyers or the advocates who are fighting these cases of indefinite detentions in the courts are not saying that don't deport them. Yes, they should not be deported. But even according to the government of India internal orders, which Dan and I have accessed and have seen, it says that you cannot indefinitely detain anybody beyond 3 months. And if you are detaining, if you want to monitor somebody beyond 3 months, you release them, you take their biometrics, they will come regularly to the police station, and you will be able to kind of monitor their movements till Myanmar and the government of India talk until they are deported. So fine, if you want to deport them, but do not detain them indefinitely in inhuman conditions. That's against international laws. That's against the Constitution of India.
So just to add to that, Priyali mentioned this court case, and what that led to was an investigation of the conditions and some instructions that they needed to be improved. And so one of the things in the report that we're calling for is that the National Human Rights Commission, and working with international, the UN Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights or another international ombudsman, join together to do a broader investigation of the conditions of detention in India.
I just want to follow up on this issue of deportation, right? Because it looms over refugees in many countries, not just India. Dan, you mentioned earlier that returning Rohingya to Myanmar is a violation of this international principle of non-refoulement. Basically means countries aren't supposed to repatriate refugees to their home countries if there's a credible threat of harm when they do so. Priyali, I understand it that this is an issue that the Supreme Court in India has weighed in on. How have they ruled?
Okay, so very surprisingly, because in the past we've always seen the judiciary uphold human rights. So very surprisingly, when this was, shockingly rather, when this was taken up at the Supreme Court actually said that the fundamental right to settle in India is only available to its citizens. And in doing so, it's questionable because, again, we need to talk about the acts or the policies in place, such as the Citizenship Amendment Act. If settling in India is only available to citizens, then shouldn't citizenship be seen or fast-tracked for all kind of persecuted populations, including the Rohingya refugees? Why should it be fast-tracked for only a certain religious population or ethnicity? And the other thing I think that the Supreme Court kind of mentioned is that they kind of underlined what the Indian government had said was that the Rohingya refugees pose as a threat to internal security of the country. And if you're talking about them as a threat to the internal security of the country, by then not monitoring them, which is what they're doing now, and kind of illegally detaining them, indefinitely detaining them, we're not improving the internal security of the country in any way. In fact, if you monitor them, if the UNHCR is allowed to register them, if they're allowed to go in and give their biometrics at police stations at regular, frequent intervals, that's when you will actually monitor the internal security and enhance the national security. By doing what you're doing now, you're only increasing all kinds of threats, right? We talk about, and this is not just us talking, we talk about factors that have led to extremism in the past. If you take somebody and put them into detention or in inhuman conditions, that's when you give rise to issues like extremism, not when you give them basic rights and human dignity.
Yeah, and I would just add to that in addition to the international principle of non-refoulement that we just spoke about, the government of India has signed on to various international agreements which enshrine that principle as well. And we've spoken to many Indian legal experts who also make the argument that within the Indian Constitution, there is there's a right to life that also obligates the government not to be returning people to places where they face a credible fear of death.
I just want to add to that every time the case of deportation is raised in 2021, the Supreme Court said deport them after consultations with the government of Myanmar. We are talking about a population that is persecuted by the government of Myanmar or by the Myanmarese authorities. We are talking about asking them if these the embassy in Myanmar, we are asking them that these people are refugees or these people are from Myanmar. That process is going to go on forever and ever. Even now, most of these cases, we've not heard any response. So we are basically saying that these people will remain in indefinite detention in terrible, inhuman conditions till any kind of discussion between the government of India or the Myanmarese government happens. And that itself is questionable.
Hey, Grant Tamasha listeners. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Putting this show together each week is a labor of love, but it takes a lot of work to put out a great show every week. If you'd like to support the work we do at Grant Tamasha, please visit ceip.org/donate. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting platform, so you'll be the first to know when a new episode rolls out. I just want to kind of pick up on this question of their conditions and their access to kind of amenities and goods and services. One of the things the report documents is whether we're talking about education, basic health, livelihood opportunities. One of the key impediments that you point to is refugees' lack of access to an Aadhaar card, right? And as most of our listeners will know, an Aadhaar number has become vital for accessing most public, in fact, many private services in India. But you also document, and this is somewhat curious, that refugees with UNHCR cards, valid cards from the United Nations, are also not able to access services. And I'm wondering, Priyali, maybe I'll start with you and then turn over to Dan. Unpack this for us, right? So what are they able to access and not able to access in their current situation?
They are able to access primary educational centers. So the right to education is up to 14 or 15 years in India. Up till that, it's possible. But any kind of higher education, which is 10th grade onwards, becomes very difficult. In fact, a woman who we spoke to during the research, and in fact, many of them said that she was preparing for her 10th grade exams and was really ready to go and give those. But when she was stopped from writing those exams because she did not have an Aadhaar card. If you don't have an Aadhaar card, you cannot get a job which is not a daily wage laborer job. You can get the daily wage laborer jobs, but how much does that give you? That is about 150 to 500 rupees, which is about $7. And that is nothing. If you don't give access to education, higher education to the new generation, then they're never even going to be able to access the jobs where they can get highly paid. So we are basically not just ruining the present generation, we are ruining the next generation. We're not giving them education, we're not giving them access to jobs. What they can access, was your question, is primary education, access to primary healthcare centers in some places, not in all places. We've heard of cases where from some primary healthcare centers, they were sent away, some pregnant women were sent away and they were not allowed to birth their children, and that led to miscarriages and also stillbirths. So it is varied. Because there is no standard policy, it is varied. An educational institute can give admission if they want. They can say no. A primary healthcare center can say, okay, we'll give you services. They can say no. There is no law. There's no policy.
But Priyali, could I just push you a little bit on this, which is, if a refugee in India has a valid registration card given to them by the UN body which governs refugees, and that is supposed to be recognized by whichever country is acting as the host country, what is the government of India's argument to say, actually, this doesn't qualify as an acceptable form of local identification?
So I'm just going to, not verbatim because I don't have the report here, but I'm going to tell you what the government of India in the response to the Delhi High Court case last month said. They said, we do not recognize UNHCR refugee cards because we are not signatory of the Refugee Convention. So if they say that in a submission to the Delhi High Court, it is totally depending on the institution that the refugee carries the UNHCR card, if they accept it or they don't accept it. We just did a local visit to Taj Mahal with some members of the refugee group. They could not even access entrance to Taj Mahal on the UNHCR card. They were treated as foreign citizens. They had to pay for the foreign entrance. That's just a small example. Nobody's life will end if they don't see Taj Mahal. But if they can't get access to good healthcare and they can't get access to good education, that's where we are questioning things like livelihood and what can happen to their lives.
Yeah, this all goes back to the lack of a clear policy from the center, because what it does is it allows local authorities to have some ambiguity, and sometimes they do allow Rohingya refugees to come and access primary education. Sometimes they allow women to access health centers to give birth. But sometimes they don't. And what they can point to is they say, well, you don't have an Aadhaar card, or in the past, the UNHCR card had allowed some level of recognition. And now there's that pushback, as Priyali mentioned, where the government of India has said UNHCR cards are of no consequence. They do not give you access to services. They do not give you access to an Aadhaar card. And that's really a key element of the status of Rohingya right now in the country. If they were to be given either recognition of the UNHCR cards or some special Aadhaar cards or some kind of card that says, and that the center comes out and says, these are people who are residents of India, then that would open up the ability to have all those kinds of services, and would take away the ability for local authorities to arbitrarily deny them even the basic services that they're supposed to be able to access.
The report mentions that there is shrinking support for the Rohingya in India. And to support this claim, you point to the fact that the NGO and civil society representatives who are advocating on their behalf all cite fear of retaliation for speaking up too loudly on behalf of this refugee population. Wondering if one of you could just help describe for us, why is it that advocates' voices have gotten softer rather than louder over time?
Sure. We spoke with several groups that have worked with the Rohingya in the past or continue to, and refugees more generally. And for obvious reasons, we do not mention them by name in the report. But they all told us that, they fear retaliation. And the number one way that they see it is they lose the permissions to receive foreign funding for their projects. And so those who work with refugees generally in India are avoiding projects with the Rohingya, or they're avoiding speaking out when they see things that are going on, or getting involved with detention cases and things like that. And what I think it comes down to a broader, trend in India, where there's pushback against any kind of criticism, but then there's a particular sensitivity to this status of Rohingya in the country. So, unfortunately, even as the crackdown on Rohingya and the issues of detention, deportation are getting hotter, getting worse. At the same time, those voices that in the past have been able to speak up for the Rohingya have been threatened and intimidated.
So I want to kind of move this conversation to a place where we can kind of look kind of into the future a bit. One of the key aspects of this report is how do we resolve the situation? The report argues that Indian politicians have used national security, Priyali had mentioned this earlier as well, as a reason for why the country doesn't want to accept Rohingya refugees. In the report, I found it really interesting. You argue that a written policy on refugees in India would actually enhance national security interests, right? So it kind of flips the traditional argument on its head. Priyali, let me ask you about this. Why would this actually be something that is net positive for India's national security interests?
I think I'm just going to reiterate what I said earlier, and I'm going to let Dan add to that. But if a refugee comes into India and India, lets them register with UNHCR legally and then gives them government identification cards, which can be easily trackable, and then they ask them to go to police stations and give their biometrics frequently, whether it's monthly, whether it's once in 2 months, it's easy to monitor the whereabouts of the person. That is how you kind of make sure that your internal security situation is taken into control. In addition to that, putting people who are already victimized in jails, in inhuman conditions, in indefinite detention, actually can cause issues of animosity. That may lead to issues of, I'm not saying in this case, but we've seen it in the past. It has led to issues of extremism. So you don't want to build a situation like this, or you don't want to kind of have a situation like this, which raises more issues of internal security. You want to stop it. You want to create a community, a host community, which is more welcoming. But Dan, please feel free to add to it.
No, I think that's exactly right. I mean, the main point is that the current system incentivizes people to stay underground, to stay under the radar, and then the lack of opportunities, the lack of building resilience within the community can lead to negative coping mechanisms and turn to crime or just making things. Whereas if you are supporting these populations, they can actually positively contribute to the society, and so that's really where we see it as the argument that this is really should be in the interest of the government of India and all countries who are hosting refugees.
Now, Dan, the parliamentarian Shashi Tharoor has twice introduced a private member bill that would enact a national law on refugees and asylum seekers. I think the first time was in 2015. I think he's reintroduced it in 2021 or 2022, if I'm not mistaken. In your view, would this bill constitute a reasonable path forward? And is there any support for it that you can detect? I mean, private member bills rarely pass. I think the last one passed in 1971, but they're often used as a way to stimulate the government into enacting a policy. What's your take on that?
Yeah, it's significant because it gets to that very core question of status for Rohingya and other refugees in the country, and for having that clear policy that we've talked about is lacking. For what is available to refugees in the country and providing basic protections and access to services. So in that regard, it would be a major step forward. But you're right. Also, it's the political winds are against it. But it does not have to be that. The Modi administration could do a lot on its own to just develop these policies. So it's both a standing set of policies that could be adopted and a roadmap for what the administration could do. And so in those respects, it's really, really important. And that's why we highlight it in the report.
So I want to end by bringing in foreign policy, right? So you note that India has always struck this very careful balancing act with the ruling regime in Myanmar. It has never looked for ways to antagonize the military junta there. At the same time, the United States, one of India's key partners, has been one of the biggest assistance providers to the Rohingya of any donor country. We know looking into the summer, there's going to be a series of high-level visits between senior Indian and U.S. officials, not least the Prime Minister's own state visit to Washington in June. Dan, let me start with you, and then Priyali, please feel free to weigh in. If you were advising the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, or the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, what is it that you would like them to do on this particular issue?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I just first emphasize that there are these series of high-level meetings coming up, and there is this interest from the Indian government, both in terms of the U.S. Relationship, but also this image of, the India was very active on the global convention on refugees and will be part of the global refugee meeting that's coming up later this year. So I think there's a lot of opportunities here. In terms of the recommendations for what the U.S. should be saying to India, I think it starts with just making clear that Rohingya, that refugee treatment is on the agenda. This is something that is important to the U.S. in the relationship. We recognize there's a lot of other issues, the geopolitical issues, relationships with balancing with China, but it has to be made clear that this is going to be on the table and something that affects the relationship. In terms of I think there's some very low-hanging fruit types of things that the Indian government could do very quickly, and the U.S. could push them for. One of those is on providing exit permissions for refugees in the country who are already accepted in third countries for resettlement, but the Indian government has not yet allowed them to leave. So I think that's number one, pushing for something like that. And then number two, just pushing back on the most egregious kinds of the things that India is doing, and that includes the forced deportation, the refoulement of Rohingya refugees back to Myanmar, and this gets to the U.S. government's recognition of what happened to the Rohingya as genocide, and Secretary Blinken's commitment to building a path out of genocide. So I think bringing that to the Indian authorities and saying, this is really important to us. We've called this genocide. We really take this seriously, and forcing people to go back to that genocidal regime will be unacceptable. And then from there, I think you can push to some of the more granular things that we've talked about allowing for status of the Rohingya and investigations into the detention conditions. But to bring it back, just the main general thing is put them on notice that this is an issue that will be important to the U.S.-India relationship.
I mean, I'll just add to that U.S. and India are great allies, have been great allies for a very long time on various issues, be it trade and also security now in the region. We look at the Quad, we look at various security issues. We also both claim to be democracies, the oldest democracy and the biggest democracy. And so our constitutions are very similar. Both our constitution upholds the right to life. And so I think we should talk at that level. Let's protect persecuted populations in our country. Let's give them refuge. And let's not build a situation where they have to be deported.
My guests on the show this week are Priyali Sur of the Azadi Project and Daniel Sullivan of Refugees International. Together, they are the authors of A Shadow of Refuge, Rohingya Refugees in India. Priyali, Dan, thank you for coming on the show. This is an issue that has not gotten a lot of attention in India, and I think a lot of our listeners might be surprised to know that it's a place where actually the courts have weighed in, politicians have weighed in, but there's still this outstanding question of what to do with these 20,000 or more refugees who are still inside India. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Milan. Thank you for having us.
Grant Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. This podcast is an HT Smartcast original and is available on htsmartcast.com. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show and to find the writing we reference on this week's episode, visit our website, granttamasha.com. Production assistance comes from Nithya Lab. Tim Martin is our audio engineer, and Isabel Villegas is our executive producer. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was a Hindustan Times production brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.